Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. Let us begin. I am Amir Pasek, Dean of the IU Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. A warm virtual welcome to Reviving American Civic Life, an event that we are co-presenting with Civic Renaissance, a newsletter and intellectual community dedicated to civic and cultural renewal. The founder and curator of Civic Renaissance, Alexandra Hudson, will be our moderator. Civic Renaissance is a newsletter and intellectual community dedicated to lifelong learning, goodness, truth, and healing our public discourse through reviving the wisdom of the past. She's an affiliate faculty member at our school and an award-winning writer and journalist, currently writing a book on civility and civic renewal. Thank you for making this event possible, Lexi.
My pleasure. Thank you, Amir.
Joining her is Les Lenkowsky, Professor Emeritus of Public Affairs and Philanthropy at Indiana University. He played a key role in shaping the academic content and culture of our school, and his illustrious career has included leading the Corporation for National and Community Service, as well as the Hudson Institute. Les is also a founder of the National Service Archives at the IUPUI Library, about which you will hear more about. This event represents a sample of the kind of programming we hope the archives will help inspire. Thanks for being with us, Les. Rounding out our panel, we are very pleased to welcome Frank Fukuyama, who is the Olivier Nomelini Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. He is the author of a range of well-known books, including The End of History and The Last Man, and more recently, Identity, The Demand for Dignity, and the Politics of Resentment. His forthcoming book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, comes out in March. He is also co-founder and chair of the editorial board of an important new magazine and media venture called American Purpose that I recommend you take a look at. It's really nice to have you with us today, Frank.
Thanks very much, Amir.
Before we turn the program to Lexi, I would like to ask my co-host and colleague, Christy Palmer, the Herbert Simon Family Dean of our library, to offer her welcome and say a few words about the National Service Archive.
Thank you, Amir. Good afternoon. So be a part of this conversation. I am Christy Palmer with the IUPUI University Library. In 2019, with the support of our then IU President, Michael McRobbie, and national service leaders such as past IU President Tom Ehrlich, Susan Stroud, Shirley Sagawa, Dr. Jean Temple, and Dr. Les Lenkowsky, University Library's Ruth Lilly Special Collections and Archives founded the National Service Archive to collect, preserve, describe, and make publicly available ephemera, manuscript collections, photographs, oral history, official documents, and other content documenting our country's national service movement. While the presidential libraries of past US presidents collect some of this content, we know that much important material is not included in these official collections, and we are committed to ensuring this content is retained for study by future generations. Content examples include Senator Harris Wofford's Corporation for National and Community Service, the papers of the Indiana Campus Compact, a partnership of Indiana's public, private, and community college higher education institutions focused on advocating, implementing, and improving community engagement efforts. The papers of John Gompertz, who's the current president and CEO of America's Promise Alliance, but who also served as the Chief of Staff for the Corporation of National and Community Service, as well as the Director of AmeriCorps, and Dr. Marcia Adler's reports and correspondence regarding her work with America Reads. We are collaborating with the national service leaders previously mentioned, as well as leaders at the IUPUI campus to develop strategies for promoting scholarship and academic programs connected to this collection. Ideally, this important collection will have an archivist dedicated to developing it, as well as connecting with the movement's leaders, policymakers, and daily participants in national service efforts. I invite you to take a look at the collections. I'll pop a link into the chat, and consider donating content if you have any content that makes sense as part of this archive to that collection. Thank you for the opportunity to share today, and I look forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christy, and thank you, Amir. And thank you to our guests, Dr. Leslie Lenkowsky and Dr. Francis Fukuyama, two of the foremost experts and thinkers on democracy and American civic life in our nation. It's a real privilege to be here to facilitate this conversation. There's a long history of being concerned and aware of the significance of civil society, these horizontal bonds between citizens, to supporting a democracy, the vertical relationship between citizens and their state. And many people were concerned, and a series of books, a kind of cottage industry of literature proliferated after Dr. Robert Putnam wrote his essay and then later book called Bowling Alone, sounding the alarm, saying actually American civil society is in crisis. We're not doing things together anymore. And this is a real threat to the state of our democratic society, our free way of life. And it's interesting to note that this book was written, the essay was written almost 25 years ago. The book was written 20 years ago, but it's kind of referenced as if it was written yesterday. And of course, his other book, The Upswing, came out just a year or two ago, which kind of doubled down and reiterated a lot of the insights from Bowling Alone about the poor state of American civic life. But I think we're all here because we know that American civic life matters to democracy and the future of our nation, and we are concerned about it. But I'd love to start by asking our panelists, what do you think of the state of American civic life today? Do we have reason to be concerned? Is it as bad as all that? Are there some bright spots that we should be concerned about? So maybe we'll start with Dr. Fukuyama and then turn to Les if that works.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lexi. So I think that the situation has changed very dramatically since Putnam wrote about the decline of civil society back in the 1990s. I was a participant in that debate, and there was always a question about whether he got the coefficient right, that actually civil society, was it actually declining or was it actually on the increase, because the form it took had simply shifted. He wrote right at the beginning of the rise of the internet. And so, today most association is mediated electronically. And that has led to a vast proliferation of new types of association, not the Elks Clubs and Shriners and so forth that he was looking at, but a very different form. But I also think that the locus of concern about civil society is different. He was worried that Americans were not participating in public life via their nonprofit organizations, their churches, their different forms of civic association. And I think right now, in many respects, the real problem is different, that many Americans are participating, and they're participating too much and in the wrong way. That is to say, the single biggest political problem I think we face in the United States today is our polarization. The fact that there's a stark divide between red and blue America. It has lots of correlates in terms of geography and education and class and so forth, but it's become, what political scientists call effective polarization, meaning you don't just disagree over policies, you actually hate people on the other side. And, one of the problems with kind of the general advocacy of civil society was that you didn't really define, what kind of civil society you wanted. And in many respects, on both sides of that red-blue divide, people are hyper-organized, right? I mean, on the extreme right, you've got the Proud Boys and various kinds of MAGA-related groups. And on the left, you've got Black Lives Matter and all of its spin-offs. But collectively, that does not lead to a civic sense in the United States as a whole, because the positions that these groups take are, in a sense, they feed off of each other, and they're diametrically opposed certainly in terms of what they want to do in terms of policy, but also the basic division or vision that they have for America. I think that a healthy civic life in America requires a certain degree of consensus. It requires the ability of people with differing values and views, certainly views on policy, to actually be able to work together. This is, the central place where this is supposed to happen is in Congress. And as we well know, Congress itself has been polarized, and with every passing year, that polarization in a sense gets deeper, but it's also supposed to happen in communities where people are supposed to come together, for matters of common interest. Now that still happens, so I don't want to overstate, especially at a local level. I think that that kind of civic cooperation is still happening, but one of the things that you see that's very disturbing is the steady politicization of many civil society organizations that formerly had been kind of politically neutral, that they're simply supposed to provide food banks, or they're supposed to promote, certain kinds of, community activities. But all of a sudden they get drawn into this underlying, very vicious polarization that's going on in the rest of the country. And all of a sudden people see them, not as kind of neutral groups that are working for a better America altogether, but they're aligned with one of the political parties, or they're secretly being manipulated by elite groups that don't have our best interest at heart, and the like. And that kind of civic organization is not healthy. The causes for it are very complicated. I really do think that the internet has played a very large role in promoting this, because it does permit the creation of what are called filter bubbles, or these closed communities where like-minded people can get in touch. Now, this is fine, you're a gay kid in a very conservative little town and you want to be connected with other people in similar situations, and the internet is perfect for that. It's not geographically limited and so forth, but it means that all of the conspiracy theory nuts in the world, can also find each other, and they can also collaborate. So I think we're in a very different world with a different set of problems in our civic life than the ones that Bob Putnam, laid out back in the 1990s.
Thank you. What you said, Dr. Fukuyama, about kind of the duality to American civic life and civic bonds reminds me of a distinction Putnam makes within social capital. He distinguishes between bonding and bridging capital. Bonding is the capital. Bonding capital is the kind of the super glue between people who are already alike, and bridging capital is the bonding between people who are unlike in some ways, but he's kind of skeptical of bonding capital. He gives the KKK, or you gave some other example, the Proud Boys, or others that kind of use civil society and build social capital within a certain group, but maybe not for pro-democratic or positive ends necessarily. So that's a really interesting distinction. Les, what do you think? What do you think about the state of American civic life, and specifically this duality we were just talking about in social capital, trust, and civil society?
Well, thank you, Lexi, and thank you, Amir and Christy, for inviting me to be on this panel. I think this is one of those times where the often used opening of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens is appropriate. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times for civil society. On the one hand, by all measures, we have the number of voluntary associations, the amount of giving, philanthropic giving in the United States has been rising almost on a steady pace, not affected much at all by the pandemic and the economic dislocation that accompanied it. We will be talking more about national service, but I think it's important to begin that we do by saying that we do have a national service program. In the federal program, AmeriCorps, there are over 75,000 people of all ages, though mostly young, participating annually, and the House of Representatives has just authorized a major expansion of it, which is unlikely to survive the Senate. But in any case, we do have a national service program after many years of discussing it, and it's likely to grow. We also have some privately run versions of it, such as what the Jesuit Volunteer Corps and others do. But on the downside, of course, there are a lot of people who think, I think correctly, that many of the voluntary associations we count exist mostly on paper, not in terms of involving people in their activities, that the amount of giving is increasingly being done, the growth in giving is increasingly coming from a smaller share of the population, not being broadly spread out. We also, to me, this is the most troubling aspect, see a continuing decline in people who regard themselves as religious, the famous rise of the nuns. And religion, as I see it, has always been a very important component of civil society. To take two other aspects of civil society, we also have many more spaces, you might say, in which people from a wide range of backgrounds can come together and exchange views. Social media, other digital platforms, I'd include in that for all their problems. I mean, an event like the one we have today with over 115 participants wouldn't have occurred 5 to 10 years ago. So we have more spaces in which people exchange views, but they're limited. And I agree with Frank on this, that there's a certain amount of selectivity and isolation that's involved, how effective they are in terms of getting people to think about their views and perhaps changing them is a question. And then from my point of view, one of the great losses of civil society is the decline in newspapers. We hear a lot of this locally, and that is a big problem. I think it probably takes me 3 minutes to get through the Bloomington Herald Times, and that's only if I'm not fully awake. There's just not a lot of reporting. In fact, I'm learning more about Indianapolis now, since the Bloomington paper is owned by Gannett, and so most of the reporters seem to be coming out of Indianapolis. So this is a loss, and it's also true nationally and internationally as well. Newspapers at all levels have been cutting back. Finally, I'd raise a question about, to me, the biggest challenge facing civil society. I think this is what Frank is getting at with polarization, is the loss of civility. We've become less tolerant in how we interact with others, disrespectful, and behave badly in lots of other ways. But again, it's worth pointing out that that's not occurring everywhere. We've seen loads of examples of voluntary cooperation during the pandemic. The stories coming out of the horrific tornado zone over the past weekend show some of this as well. And I think even, although here it's quite subjective, that what we see in Congress often is the exterior, and it looks quite polarized and probably is. But I think if you were to look, we're able to be a fly on the wall and see members of Congress deliberate things, you would find that the picture may be a little bit different, might be a lot more respectful exchange, even if the end is not to result in agreement. So I'd finally end, good times, bad times, but I think it was always thus of civil society. We tend to romanticize the civil society that Alexis de Tocqueville portrays, but it had its good sides and it had its bad sides. And today we have pretty much the same picture.
I think that's a good point, Liz, that the rise and fall, the kind of sort of creative destruction, the civic churn is a phrase I've said, has always been there, that the associations have changed in form, but and maybe even the name of the institution, but not necessarily, but the character that Tocqueville noted, that we join, we do, we associate to solve problems has always been there. Robert Wuthnow from Princeton University in his Loose Connections, I think his book is called, was part of this response to Putnam that came out in the late 90s and early 2000s, where he talked about this exact point that you're making, that associations have changed in form, but not in substance. So maybe we're not joining Rotary clubs or Kiwanis clubs, especially younger generations. We're not attracted to formal structured environments, but we're still doing things. We're still having people over for dinner. We're still bringing a meal to a friend in need. These are kind of less formal forms of civic activity that are harder to track as well. We know that what measured often is what gets done, and these kind of things won't show up in IRS data, but there's still reason to believe that they're there and present, and maybe it's reason to hope that things are not all as bad as we think. And it's interesting, you noted, so Dr. Fukuyama noted sort of a duality of bonding capital and civil associations. You noted that people are concerned, Les, about philanthropy and philanthropists having maybe outsized influence in our world today. Philanthropy and giving is a core part of American civic life. But I remember attending an event with Robert Reinsch from Stanford University, who wrote a book on, I forget the title of his book. Maybe one of you can remind me, but it was expressing this concern. Just giving about how philanthropy might be undermining democracy, actually, kind of counterintuitively. And he had this very provocative line where he called Bill Gates the de facto Secretary of Education in our country, because the Gates Foundation donates so much to our country that its policy by philanthropy. He's not democratically elected, but he's able to, gear resources to the kind of policies that he wants to promote, which is an interesting point to this sort of duality. Really quickly, a housekeeping question. We will turn to questions in about 20 minutes. So those listening and interested in partaking in the conversation, please get your questions ready. Feel free to put those in the Q&A section now, and we'll get those ready. And thanks to those of you who submitted questions before this event as well. Those have helped guide and shape this dialogue. So thank you very much. And one last housekeeping thing, we are giving away a copy of Dr. Fukuyama's most recent book on identity. So just for registering for this event, you will be automatically entered, but for additional consideration, feel free to live tweet the event, tweet the Lilly School, tweet Civic Renaissance, and share your thoughts about this dialogue. But thank you so much to all of you again for being here. Get your questions ready and feel free to share your thoughts on social media and to be entered into this giveaway for Dr. Fukuyama's wonderful book on identity. So what I'm curious, what do you guys think? What are the greatest threats? We talked threats to American civic life, or barriers to American civic life. We talked a lot about a number of issues. The internet, there's a duality there. Maybe as Les mentioned, the nationalization of our public discourse, the loss of local reporting, local newspapers. It's interesting. The Indianapolis Star, also owned by Gannett. There's a former Supreme Court justice here in Indiana who actually tracks all of the local stories. And it's on that the Indianapolis Star publishes, and it's on average, 3 to 5 a day, whereas 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was primarily local news, but it's all nationally syndicated content because it's just easier and cheaper, and local reporting is expensive. So those are some of the threats to American civic life. What are some other threats to and barriers to American civic life that we can identify to maybe help us think more clearly about some solutions?
Well, maybe I could jump in on this first, Frank.
Yeah, please.
Because what I want to point out, I've been doing this for a long time. It used to be a feature of my speeches when I headed National Service Corporation. It should be of interest to this school and the participants in this webinar, many of whom I would guess are professionals in the field of philanthropy. We have been professionalizing civil society for a very long time, and there's lots of good stuff about that. We have plenty of schools and programs, but the question I think we need to address is whether in professionalizing civil society, we have lost something as well, which is the role of the caring volunteer. In my speeches, I used to ask the audience the question, if you were to wake up in intensive care after an operation in a hospital, would you rather be looking at a registered nurse or what we used to call, maybe we still do, a candy striper, a volunteer in hospitals who comes around with newspapers and other things to make your stay a little bit better and is always good for a nice chat? Well, obviously, we want both in some sense, but we have been looking at hospitals, schools, social service agencies, museums, in terms of professionalizing what they do. And in the course of that, I worry that we have lost some of the engagement in these organizations that make civil society flourish.
Yeah, actually, if I could build on that. So I think that there's always been this kind of tension in the civil society literature about what the limits and definition of civil society is, because if you're simply looking at private associations that are neither family nor the state, that's a big group. And in fact, the professionalization extends all the way up to, let's say, trade associations, the US Chamber of Commerce that is hyper organized. It extends to all of the interest groups that exist out there, like for example, if you look at the health sector, every disease has an organization attached to it, the Kidney Association or the prostate, people that are concerned about prostate problems, they've all got a separate organization. And they all, are pushing mostly for Congress to do something in terms of subsidies or, special favors. And if you only have that kind of civil society without political parties and without an aggregating mechanism, you basically get a kind of unrepresentative outcome, because it's the best organized group and the best resource group that is able to dominate. One issue that I've been particularly concerned about has to do with participation, because one of the biggest changes to democratic practice over the past, let's say, 20 years has been the rise of participatory mechanisms other than elections. And so, for example, if a regulatory agency wants to publish a new rule, they have to publish it in the Federal Register. It goes up for notice and comment. In a certain sense, you can't start an infrastructure project without having public hearings where interested parties show up. And in the way we select candidates for our two political parties, with the rise of primaries, we also invite popular participation rather than selection of candidates via, the party professionals. That was the way we did it up until the 1970s and all the Watergate scandals. This is supposed to actually make democracy stronger and more representative. And I would argue that in many ways it's done the opposite. Because when you hold one of these formal public participatory meetings, who shows up at them? Is it ordinary citizens, like your plumber that's busy, meeting his production schedule? Or is it going to be a professionalized, well-organized interest group? It's going to be the latter. I think that one of the reasons that the parties have both shifted, Republican Party shifted right and the Democratic Party shifted left, is precisely because of popular primaries. The people that show up to vote in a primary election, they're always low turnout elections. Who turns out to vote? It's the activists. It's the organized activists that then mobilize their friends to come, vote for a particular candidate. And that has pushed both of the parties, out to the extremes. In California, we've got, initiatives, referenda, recalls, all these direct democracy moves. So the initiative system in California was supposed to get around a corrupt legislator and allow citizens to make decisions directly. How do you win an initiative in California? Money. if you don't have $100 million, you're never going to get your initiative passed, because being a big state, you have to go on television. Television is really expensive. Who has money? It is a highly organized, well-resourced interest group. And so I think that, the professionalization that Les has described has had this undemocratic impact, such that the actual groups that influence policy are really not representative of, a kind of unorganized middle of America. They are the groups that are able to get the resources and the organization together to, use these mechanisms to participate. And, I think it's part of the reason our politics is skewed. It's, part of the reason we can't build infrastructure, because what happens when you hold a hearing, the big companies show up and the environmentalist groups show up and they have a big face-off, and you don't get actually a reasonable outcome out of that process.
Mm. It's a great point you both made about the professionalization of the philanthropic industry. The class I teach for the Lilly School as an adjunct professor is called Storytelling and Philanthropy. And one thing I try to remind students is the original meaning of the word philanthropy, philanthropia. It comes from the Greek love of humanity, and kind of reclaiming that fundamental empathy, that recognizing the fundamental humanity of the people that we're trying to serve. And that, interestingly enough, this relates to my project and my research on civility, which Les noted as a threat to American civic life. There's some interesting etymological history that the word philanthropy in ancient Greece found expression in Latin in the word humanitas, which also meant love of humanity. That was the purpose of education. It was to cultivate our humanity, to help us appreciate, what it meant to be human, and then better respect and appreciate the humanity of others, of those around us. In the Italian, this found expression as the concept civility, and this is also the purpose of education, which I think is interesting. Today, we there are kind of separate discourses. There's civic discourse as a kind of genre. Then there's civil society as a genre, and then there's kind of etiquette as a genre as well. And these are all kind of discrete, but in my mind, they have historically across history been linked very inextricably. Like our conduct privately affects our conduct publicly, and we have to be educated to train and trained to and cultivated to bring forth the best of ourselves to civic and public life, which I think is really interesting. And I think we'd be remiss to overlook that history, especially as it relates to another barrier to civil society today, which is political polarization, which we've talked about, which I think again links back to just a fundamental lack of respect for the basic humanity of our fellow persons and our fellow citizens, where it's become, there's so many factors that have made it's very easy to demonize and vilify people that may just disagree reasonably on, reasonable minds might just disagree on an issue, but we've gotten beyond that, where it's like, if we disagree, you are no longer valuable. You are less than a person. What do we do about that once that, and it seems like it's a race to the bottom, where and just an iterative cycle where one party wants to kind of outdo the other? Is there a way to break this vicious cycle of dehumanization and animosity to maybe elevate our public discourse and recover some civility in our civic culture?
Well, that's a tough one. I think that there are some structural changes that you could consider in our political system. For example, I think that the plurality election system that we use in the United States tends to promote polarization. It's Duverger's law that's familiar to political scientists. When you have a plurality voting system, you tend to get a two-party system. And if you move to either ranked choice voting or proportional representation, both the Democrats and the Republicans are actually two separate parties. I mean, they both have wings, and they could actually be separately represented. So that's a kind of top-down measure that would require, political action by legislatures and this sort of thing. There's also bottom-up action. I'm on the board of a group called Braver Angels. They started out as Better Angels, but somebody had actually patented the name already, so they had to change it. But it's organized by David Blankenhorn, and what they're doing on a grassroots level is to actually get people that have very different political affiliations to simply come together and talk. And the emphasis is really not on a political agenda, it is on building precisely those kinds of virtues and civic consciousness that you, Lexi, were talking about as being necessary to actually have a civil organization. And I was amazed. I was kind of skeptical when David started this thing that he could actually make a difference, but the organization has now got chapters in practically every American state. And, there's a lot of people that are very worried about, the lack of civility, and participation in that group and others like it, I think is, one possible way forward.
Yeah, I certainly agree with the value of efforts like that, not only at the local level, but promoted nationally. But I don't think we ought to put all the weight of this, of the trend you described, Lexi, on civil society. There are other issues as well, including the struggles many people have with money, with raising families, with working, all sorts of ways that make it much harder for them to see the value of civil society. When the Great Recession occurred in 2008, there were a whole host of folks who expected that this would be good for volunteering. People were losing jobs, they'd have more time to volunteer. We were going to reverse bowling alone. In fact, the opposite happened. Why? Because volunteering, like philanthropy, grows out of a variety of civic and social relations that already exist, including and especially those in places like the workplace, church congregations, and so on. And when those are struggling for all sorts of reasons, a healthy civil society becomes much more difficult. I understand the medical reasons why so many states, including California, of course, banned religious congregations from meeting at the tougher parts of the pandemic. But I think from a social point of view, this was quite unwise. That through congregations, people learn to work together to reinforce one another, maybe even become more caring about one another than would lead them to do things like wearing masks or getting vaccinations. We've tended to underplay the role of civil society, and as a result, we get less of it. In the 1918 flu epidemic, a historian at the University of Michigan once has concluded there was a greater sense of civic responsibility, which affected the reaction to the spread of flu. I asked him about this, and he felt it was because it occurred at the end of World War I, and that's certainly true, but World War I was not exactly a popular war in lots of places. What was also happening with the flu epidemic is it came at the end of a period from about the late 19th century to the 1920s that we often think of as a great time for civil society. In fact, the phrase social capital was coined during that period. And I think it was building off of that helped the response to the flu, even though scientifically and medically, we did not even know what was causing that flu until the 1930s. We were much less well off than we are today. Fast forward to what we've been going through the past 2 years, not only has civil society been less robust, but we have taken measures in the name of public health that make it harder for those institutions to flourish. And that, I think, leads to the kind of attitudes you were describing.
Mm. I appreciated Dr. Fukuyama's framework of in terms of solutions, the top-down solutions versus the bottom-up solutions, the top-down being the institutional fixes to our democratic system, to our voting system, ranked choice voting, for example, that could potentially depolarize, tone down the heat in our national discourse, and maybe pave a path for a more robust civic life, and bottom-up solutions such as such as Braver Angels, who the Lilly School and Civic Renaissance have partnered with in the past on an event this past summer with the Tocqueville family at the Tocqueville Chateau in Normandy, which was a wonderful event conversation. I'm wondering, in that kind of polarity, where does national service fit? National service is something that Les is an expert on, written a lot about, and this is a solution that Dr. Fukuyama mentions at the end of his book on identity as a possible solution to heal the deep divides and that our identity politics has fomented in our current political environment. National service has been criticized as ineffective, as being too top down, too coercive. Is there and we've had AmeriCorps that Les has mentioned and other forms of this program in place for many years. So my question is there a form in which this the concept of national service could be a possible solution? And Dr. Fukuyama, in terms of your commendation of a national service program, how do you respond to some of the criticisms of past programs that are already in existence, and how might a new version of this be a part of the solution? So feel free, either one of you, feel free to jump in.
Frank, do you want to start, or shall I?
No, I think you should, Les.
Well, I could spend another few hours on this if you want, but when national service has a long history in the United States. Originally, the idea, Edward Bellamy's idea in the 19th century, was a way to get useful work done by a volunteer army of workers. When AmeriCorps was created, it really had two major goals. One was to get things done, which is to say, to help accomplish important tasks in education and others, but also to instill a new sense of civic commitment, particularly among the rising generation. As you noted, some things have worked well, some things not so well. What I would prefer to see is something along the lines that William F. Buckley Jr. argued for in one of his least well-known books, Gratitude. He pointed out the purpose of national service is to enable all of us to express gratitude to our country for being a citizen here, for having the privilege of being part of this country. So he proposed a national service program that would essentially enroll everyone, maybe after high school graduation or something like that. But key difference is the person involved gets to pick where he or she wants to go. So if, for example, you are grateful to the nursing home that took care of your elderly grandparents, you could spend your national service year there as a volunteer. And in exchange, rather than a stipend, you would get certain advantages, maybe more heavily subsidized student loans, and so on. I think the problem of our current national service program is it operates pretty much like any federal grant and aid. Organizations compete, they get money, they use it to retain AmeriCorps members. It'd be much better, I think, if we individualize this, created a far wider range of opportunities for people to express their gratitude to their country. I just wrote a column about Colin Powell, on the occasion of his death. And this is a theme that runs throughout Colin Powell's life. And he grew up in a time and lived in places where racial segregation was not only prevalent, but deadly. And yet he said what motivated him was a sense of gratitude for being an American. The organization he founded was named America's Promise for that reason. I think that's a spirit we need to reinculcate in national service programs.
Yeah, I know a lot less about national service than Les does, but it really just struck me as good for a couple of reasons. One is, the cultivation of a sense of citizenship. In our democracy these days, we think of ourselves as having rights, and the focus has really been on protecting and expanding the sphere of those rights. But we have not laid terribly much emphasis on duties to the broader society. And I think there's an alternative way of thinking about liberalism and about what a liberal republic should look like that is sometimes labeled a Republican tradition. It starts with Machiavelli and evolves. Some of the American founding fathers were very much on board with this idea that the purpose of a liberal society is not simply to leave people alone so that they can pursue their private passions and interests, but it's also to cultivate character in the specific sense of generating people that are public spirited. And when Tocqueville talked about citizenship and what a democracy should look like, I think that's really what he had in mind. Was you want a group of citizens that feel like they have a responsibility for public interest, and therefore they pay attention, they participate, they're active citizens and not simply private individuals. And I think that a program of national service would do a lot, along those lines. I also just, think of the military, the U.S. military, although there's a lot of kind of literature on this subject. I think in the end, it's been one of the most successful organizations. There's two big divisions and two big types of diversity. One is the kind of gender, race, ethnicity form of diversity. The military is, really good. I mean, as someone once said, this is the only place where a Black man can order a white, kid around and have no pushback against it. But also class diversity, because one of the things I certainly feel living in Palo Alto, teaching at Stanford, is apart from the guy that comes to fix my, my heater, I have to deal with working class people almost never. And I think that a good national service program would try to bridge both these class and gender, ethnic, racial kinds of divides by by creating a space in which very diverse people actually have to do something together. And I think that in itself would be very useful.
Thank you both. So we'll turn to audience Q&A now. We have a great list of questions. Feel free to keep dropping your questions in the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can. But there are a few questions that touched on the question of civics education and the potential for civics education at the local, state, or federal level to potentially revive American civic life. I mean, my immediate response is, we're in such a divided time. It's not surprising that civics education, how do we teach our history? How do we teach what it means to be a citizen, has become a forefront of the culture war. We had the 1619 Project, and then we had the 1776 Commission that Donald Trump created. And I mean, any education on civics generally, but also education generally, more broadly, it gets to questions of fundamental values and first principles that are also part of the culture war. So is there any hope for any version of civics education that could be a tool of healing and revival of civic life, and not just fuel on the flame of an already divided and civically frayed time?
I guess I would start with the old first aid principle: first, do no harm. And I think a lot of what we do under the name of civic education, or sometimes in schools will be called government or political science courses, may inadvertently do harm. If you were to take any government or political science courses, one of the first things you would be taught is your vote doesn't matter. And that's true. In most elections are not decided by a single vote or even a relatively small number of votes. But from another point of view, your vote does matter because it is an expression of your commitment as a citizen. So I think civics education courses really need to look carefully at the messages they are conveying to future citizens about what it means to be a citizen, and avoid conveying messages that suggest citizens are not very important.
What do you think, Dr. Fukuyama? Is there anywhere where civics education?
Yeah, I'm not sure that that would be what would come out of the mouths of, certainly my political science colleagues today. But, most American universities 50 years ago thought that one of their roles was actually to create citizens, not just people with specific knowledge and skills, but people that could take leadership positions in American society, and therefore they would teach kind of American history and institutions courses as part of their core curricula. And as a result of the changes in American society, the rise of multiculturalism and a lot of other things, they stopped doing that. Stanford got rid of its core Western culture track back in the late 1980s after a lot of protests, from students and so forth. And most elite, especially the elite schools, simply do not go anywhere near, the idea of having students learn a common, just factual knowledge about what does the Constitution say, or what are the three branches, and what do the courts do, this sort of thing. They don't require that kind of knowledge of any of their graduates. The reason that I think that it may be more possible to do this than what Les is suggesting is that my personal experience in teaching undergraduates over the years is that they actually know a fair amount about American civics, and they've all taken it in their AP history courses in high school. And that's actually been a pretty effective way. Now, that only affects elites because, the vast bulk of students do not get into these AP courses. But, at least for that group, it's been possible to agree on a kind of common set of textbooks and information that needs to be communicated. Maybe that's going to fall victim to polarization, and there's evidence that that's already been happening in a lot of places. But, I do think that there is some value to this, but it's just not a short-term solution. Even if you had the most ambitious project to revive civic education, you're talking about something that will take effect maybe in 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And it's really not going to get us out of our current, crisis.
Yeah, it's hard to think of anything coming out of Washington that's civics related that would unite us. It doesn't matter what administration is issuing it. So we have another question about the role of cable television and talk news and how it has affected American civic life. And that's interesting, I think, because this, of course, was the big bad in Robert Putnam's account of American civic life. In his account of the rise and fall, like American civic activity peaked in the 60s, but then television was introduced and it has just been a monolithic decline ever since. That's his account. amount of American civic history in bowling alone. And he pinpoints the introduction of television as the reason why we're not doing things together anymore. How has television, do you think, affected American civic life today? I love the documentary about Bill Buckley and Gore Vidal called The Best of Enemies that talks about how they were their exchange during one presidential convention, a nomination convention, was just kind of a low watermark in public discourse that kind of opened the floodgates of the kind of talking heads shouting at each other on television that we see on every cable news television show today, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, The View, whatever it is. So what do you think? Do you think that Putnam was right, and has it just gotten worse? Has it continued to contribute to the challenges we have today? What do you think?
Putnam wrote his book in the mid-90s, just as the internet was getting off the ground. And therefore, he didn't really take account of that major change in the way that people consume media. And so, attention and viewers have been leaching away from legacy media like television. Newspapers, the crisis is much more serious, but television still is the way that especially older Americans continue to get information and news. And it interacts with the internet because oftentimes stories start on the internet and then the networks pick it up and broadcast it. I think that in general, they're not doing a very helpful job because, they've become as polarized as the rest of the society. And so they act as big megaphones for, toxic information or disinformation. And, for at least a certain demographic, they're still very, they're very powerful at that.
Yeah, I didn't buy Putnam's argument then. I don't buy it now. And the reason I don't is that I think the media has always been bad in this sense. Walter Lippmann, in Public Opinion, which he wrote when the hot new technology was the radio, said that the media trade in stereotypes, not in providing facts and information. And why is that? Because people are attracted to newspapers, to radio based on their prior beliefs, rather than out of a desire to get new information, let alone have their beliefs corrected. And I don't think that's changed very much. I think what has changed is that people don't feel a need to try and reach out to sources with which they may not agree just to see what's going on, that the media themselves have become much more adept and much more in dealing with stereotypes, and frankly, the stereotypes have gotten worse. So I think the media is not as bad as it was portrayed as being, but isn't a savior either.
Well, thank you so much to Dr. Fukuyama, to Dr. Lenkowsky, to Les, two wonderful friends and mentors. And I'm just grateful so much to both of you for your work independently, but also your role in my life and your role and thinking deeply about this important topic. Thank you to Amir for facilitating this event, and especially to Amy Connolly as well for doing the behind the scenes work. Amy, we really appreciate you. And so we'll be in touch with the winner of Dr. Fukuyama's book on identity. And thank you all for caring enough to spend a bit of your afternoon talking about how to revive American civic life, a very urgent and important problem in our world today. Any final words, Amir, or anything else to say?
Thank you, Lexi, for a wonderful job. Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Les. Thanks, Christy, for helping us put this together. And thank you to all our participants as well.
Merry Christmas, everyone. Bye.
Hey, bye.
Thank you. Bye.